Assalamualaikum, Nikaan Kamemon, Kanyo Katan, Salakanulangon, sa lahat. Today I will be presenting the paper, The Collection and Dissemination of Sama Stories. This is a presentation of over 15 years of work with the Sinama language, and I hope that we'll get good question and answer times later if technology allows for that. You are welcome. Bangkambilay tilaw ni ako Sinama, minsan matausug, or the Tagalog language. We don't have to do all English. I am a trained linguist and speak Sinama fluently, and also understand a lot in other Filipino languages. Were the Sama on the losing side of the Battle of Malacca? Did the Sama lose faith in the politics of Johor? How much were the Sama involved in the spreading of the stories of Islam in Sulu and to mainland Mindanao? How about stories from even further back, stories about contests with birdmen, great giants of the mountains, and deities coming down from the heavens on the rainbow? Did they spread by the boats and boa of the Sama? The answers to these questions may be long forgotten, possibly even irretrievable. Could a language be completely swallowed up? Was Sinama swallowed up by Malay in Sumatra, Johor, and Riau? Is Sinama being swallowed up at this moment by Tausug, Tagalog, Bisaya, and Malay? What defense do the Sama have to protect their language, their culture, their existence as a people? This opening for the paper might come out of nowhere, but it is a reflection on what I've been studying over the last 5 years as I put together a master's thesis on the topic of guru discipleship and found linguistic evidence that linked the Sama in the Johor and the area of Malacca hundreds of years ago, even near the time of the arrival of Magellan and the Portuguese, and prior to that in Sumatra. And really there are stories, there are words that particularly link the Sama people to that area, but when you look at what's written, we only find a group called the Orang Laut, and today it is debated whether this group, the Orang Laut, is the same as the Sama or if it's a different group entirely. The Orang Laut of modern day Malaysia speak, for the best of my knowledge, speak a dialect of Malay. So the concern then here is that from the Philippines context, what are we doing to preserve the Sinama language? What is being done? And why is this important? So the call to action of my paper is tell your stories, record your stories, remember your stories, and write your stories. And of course this is a conference not solely talking about the Sama, but certainly the Tausug, other groups of the Sulu archipelago, the Yakan presumably, even in the greater context of Mindanao and the Philippines. Much work remains to be done in the literature of minority groups in the Philippines. So to give you a little bit more of a background on myself, I came to the Philippines as a linguist in training, and the first language that I learned in the Philippines was the Maguindanaon language. I spent 2 years on a college internship, and then eventually met my wife in the same work. She was a trained linguist, but she is a Sama, and we got married, and so I switched my work to work with the Sama. And in 2009, put up the website Koman Sama Online with the goal of having a place online for Sama to interact. At the time, I had some sort of vision of a Facebook for the Sama language, and that never came to full fruition. But along the way, I was introduced to many great stories of the Sama people, many stories that, as far as I know, have yet to have been told. And so I'll share a little bit of those stories in this presentation. I have quite a bit of stories that I'm aware of, maybe even have recorded, but haven't been able to release yet to the public, and other stories maybe that I've chosen not to release to the public. And the goal of this paper, the goal of this conversation, is to think about how can we increase the amount of Sama oral literature that makes its way into written form. There's a real urgency to the preservation of these stories. Over the last 15 years, I have multiple friends of mine who have been good storytellers who have passed away, and their stories will no longer be available to us. So one that particularly comes to mind is my friend Mbo Etek. You can see him in this picture. Mbo Etek is a man that I would see passing by his house as I was going to another friend's house, and I'd stop and I'd talk with him, and he'd always be in his pambahay, always be at the house relaxing, shirt off, but he told me I have a story. It's a good story. It's so good. In fact, it won a competition in Tawi-Tawi, and it was recorded by Governor Macba at the time. And he was proud of this story, but he always told me, you know, if we're going to do this, he wanted to do it formally. He wanted to be dressed up and have the right setting. And so, unfortunately, he told me this story. We did get the right setting, and we went through 10 minutes of the story. It's the only story that I've heard in Sinama that follows a rhyming pattern outside of the musical art form of tennis. But this was a poem, a taraso, and he shared the story with me. He got to about 10 minutes, actually 11 minutes, and he said, let's cut it for now, and we'll do this again at another time. And that another time never came, because he died last year while we were in the United States. And so now I don't have the ability to get that story from him. As with other dear friends of mine who have told good stories to me, multiple of those friends have passed away. Within my family, even my wife's advice to me, if you want to know good stories in Sinama, the person you should ask is her Kakaferds. And the reason to ask Kakaferds is because he spent the most time with their grandfather Biral, and their grandfather Biral was quite a storyteller and had lots of fascinating stories that he would share with his grandson Ferds. Unfortunately, I approached Kakaferds and asked him, what stories can you share me that you learned from Mbo Biral? Magmaap kasi pakalipat ko na. I have forgotten now the stories that I learned from Mbo Biral. And so with Mbo Biral also no longer being here on this earth, that leaves us with the problem that these stories were wonderful stories. They're even remembered by his grandchildren as wonderful stories, but they don't remember the stories themselves. And so we need to take action to have these stories preserved. So in my paper, I discuss key factors for collecting Sama stories: relationships, language and cultural fluency, setting, what medium, and then community-based workshops are some of the ways that we have collected stories. So starting with relationships, first of all, let me stress that Sama people themselves, you have the best ability to collect your stories. You have insider status, meaning that you already have relationships in place. You have the grandpa who has the stories that you can record down from him. You have uncles in community. You have the setting. People trust you because you're part of the family. And so you have the ability, but not only just the ability, it seems to me like you have the responsibility to collect those stories and to share them. As an outsider, I found that often stories came after relationship. One example of this is my friend Aukal Kinista, known as Bapa'o. He was a little bit deaf from a diving accident, and when I first met him, I was an early language learner, and so I was interested in Sama stories. I asked him, do you have any stories that you know that you could share with me? And I'm sorry, Luke, I can't really think of anything at this moment, was his answer. And actually, I believe that really what was being said is, I don't know you very well. And also, the setting wasn't very great. We were out just talking on the edge of a bridge, and it was just me and him. And then I found out 3 years later, he shared with me two stories that I really love. The story of the conflict between the Kuya Makabat, monkeys fighting sea cucumbers at the ocean shoreline, and then also the story of the Kuya Maka Sagakabat Magbono. This is a conflict between monkeys and the butterflies, and both comical in nature, both worthy of laughter. And he knew these stories, obviously, but did not share them with me until 3 years later, after we had developed. Cultural fluency was also a part of this case study, that as a new language learner, I was not ready to hear these stories yet. I would not have understood them completely. I would not have been able to laugh at the right times. And so the setting, the language and cultural fluency was something that I had to develop over time before it wouldn't be wasted to tell a good story to Luke Schroeder and have him not understand it. Instead, 3 years later, he told me the stories, and I'm grateful that he did. Returning to the concept of relationship, even multiple storytellers for me are people that I am related to. And the very first story that I ever shared on the website, Koman Sama Online, is it's a the language and cultural fluency was something that I had to develop over time before it wouldn't be wasted to tell a good story to Luke Schroeder and have him not understand it. Instead, 3 years later, he told me the stories, and I'm grateful that he did. Returning to the concept of relationship, even multiple storytellers for me are people that I am related to. And the very first story that I ever shared on the website, Komansama Online, it's a child's chant that I learned from my wife, who is a Sama, so I have a relationship with her, and because we had a newborn child. And so she wanted to share with our child and with me the child chant Ombo Takia, which is a chant that you put the child on your legs, rock him back and forth, and chant Ombo Takia Buli Baung Paragsa, Paragsa ni Katigan, Katigan Baung Baung. Suruk, 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 suruk. And there's multiple versions of this, multiple verses of this, but this was the verse that my wife knew and wanted to share with me because of our relationship. So again, a lot of our ability to collect stories is based off of relationship. The setting for the telling of the stories is a key factor. There have been times, particularly one instance back in 2015, I remember walking into a room with multiple Sama men, and they had caught word that Luke speaks Sinama fluently, and so they were all talking, upon entering in the room, the question they had for me, Ai storita ilu? Ai storita ilu is basically just their way of saying, what should we talk about? But I chose to take it literally, and I told them a story in Sinama. Maybe I told them one of the monkey stories, I don't remember. And because I told that story, because there was a group of men all gathered around, they decided to start sharing their stories. And actually, because of this, I got multiple stories, 8 stories, on that occasion. And so even a simple being in the right place, if you recognize this is a place where people are ready to tell stories, you can share a story yourself and be surprised at what you get back. Because Ai Storita Ilu can be an invitation just for conversation, or tell a good story and get a good story back. Often I found that the right environment for listening to and hearing stories is when a group of men are gathered, and this often happens prior to a funeral, or the feeding, particularly at the wake rituals, or prior to a wedding. And so being ready for those stories, being ready maybe with a story of your own, would give you the chance to hear the stories. And then finally, going back to the story of Mbo Etek, there is a matter of formality. He had always told me that he would like to be dressed up, and he would like to have a dulang. And unfortunately, I did not understand the significance of the dulang at that time, and was not able to provide that for him, which I regret. And I mentioned here the community-based workshops. We've been able to be involved in 3 different writers' workshops. One where we took 2 members of the Matina Playa community in Davao City and brought them in to the office of Rael Philippines in Davao, and they were working on a reading primer along with an explanation. I think we went straight to reading primer on that occasion, and then they were able to tell a story and write a big book over it. And then the second writers' workshop was their whole community, and this one had the right setting because it was held at Matina Playa Elementary School within walking distance of the community, and we had great relationships for that workshop. 3 of the linguists on my team at the time had learned their language in that community. Actually, I was the only foreign linguist that hadn't learned my Sinama in that community, but the 3 others, they were there. We had 2 Sama-trained linguists. My wife and my friend, Kaka Omarjan Jahuran, were both there to collect these stories, and because of the relationships, because of the language and cultural fluency, because the setting was right, we've had workshops in hotels that haven't been effective, or as effective at least. We were able to bring quite a few of the elders, or at least adults of the community, to share their stories in that community-based workshop setting. And then the 3rd workshop setting that I've been involved with is Bloom Library workshops, teaching people how to use the Bloom software to tell stories. And it's been a mixed bag of what we've collected. We've collected a lot more personal experience stories than folk tales, and yet these are completely valid literature that are useful for the Sama to have and to teach children reading, and to interest them in the life of their parents and of their grandparents and what their tribe is. along the way, I've had to deal with certain personal bias, and you have to take considerations of what stories are worth sharing, or is there a reason why I wouldn't want to share this story. So I've found 3 biases that I have that sometimes have kept me from sharing a story, or I've had to make changes to the story that I wanted to put forth for your consideration today. One is a bias of conflicting with one's understanding of the truth. A second bias is concerns about cultural image, and a third bias, appropriateness according to modern society standards. So my example for the conflict with one's understanding of truth is a rather controversial one. It's a story of the prophets gathering together to eat, and they were eating meat, and they ate all of the pork. Magmaap kam topic ito. Because of this, the Prophet of Islam arrives, and he arrives late. And arriving late, there's nothing left, and so he bans all of his followers from getting to eat pork. Now, this is a story that I've heard in Sama community. I can't say whether it originates from the Sama or from outsiders, but from my understanding, none of the prophets would have ate pork, and so it conflicts with my idea of truth. And so that maybe it's an entertaining story for those in community, but this is just an example of this story exists, and is it something that we want to share, or is it something that should end? Also a very interesting version of the story of Cain and Abel that, to the best of my knowledge, it conflicts with how I understand the story of Cain and Abel. Mbo Adam and Siti Hawa have 21 children. 10 girls, 10 boys. 10 girls, 11 boys. And so that means that one of their sons is without a wife, and that son is Cain. And so this is the reason that he murders Abel, so that he can have a wife, which I'm not sure the origin of that story, but should it be something shared, or is it something worth? I shared it with you now. Another concern I have is about cultural image. There's a whole genre of stories that start off with our kamatuahan were ignorante, and so they thought that they would use this material for this thing, and they didn't realize that it was used for this. And so one story in this genre that particularly comes to mind is the sugarcane, that they tried to use sugarcane as some form of a building material. I don't remember if it was as a katig, as a outrigger for a boat, but as they were working with it, it just so happened that the sugarcane splattered onto their tongue, and they tasted and realized this is sweet, and that's how they discovered sugarcane. My problem with this sort of story is it portrays those before our time, the generations that have gone before, as being ignorant, and I do not believe that. I believe that those before our time were able to navigate the sea and do lots of amazing things, for survival. They built a culture and a society that has lasted until today, and so I don't think it's fair to portray them as ignorant. And then the third that I mentioned is appropriateness according to modern society standards. There's multiple stories I can think of for this, but one of the stories or genre of story really that stand out is there's quite a few stories that the Sama have about Sibisu, Sibuta, Silibat, Makasipupul. This is blind man, deaf man, blind man, cross-eyed man, and armless man. And so these are jokes, and people find them funny. One of the stories is about climbing up a tree and fighting over the climbing up the tree. I won't share all the details, but this story as a joke in our community writers workshop, originally they were thinking, will we tell this story? And then they decided there was enough in the story that wasn't appropriate, that they changed the characters to children, and they changed the guava tree to a wani tree, and the kids were fighting over wani because the one child below was not being given the wani that was in the tree above. So sometimes our solution has been to alter the story slightly. In this case, for that workshop, the people themselves chose to alter the story considerably, but this is a consideration that has to be made with sharing stories. Key factors for sharing Sama stories, I've wrote out 3 in my paper: orthography, choice of medium, and ease of access. And so I wanted to start with orthography. Actually, with the passing of MTB, MLE into law, where minority languages were supposed to have their languages used in public schools so that they could learn faster and come up to speed and open up a child's mind to education in their own language. the very first step then that was given to us, well, you need to create an orthography for your language. And in hindsight, I see this as being a hindrance, because actually in Sinama's had an orthography for years, and it's a good orthography that considers the language features of Sinama. Sinama is different than, for instance, the Tagalog language or the Malay language on the other side of the border, and so therefore any way that we represent Sinama in writing should take into consideration those features. We had an unfortunate incident that happened in the workshop in Zamboanga City. I wasn't there, but as they were trying to come up with an orthography to use so they could get to other things like making reading primers and making stories, they worked real hard for the entire week, and then on the last day the head of the KWF entered and declared everything that they did as wrong. In fact, he wrote up a paper about it, and so the efforts of those teachers and of those linguists and of those members of the community went to waste, and we ended up struggling with orthography workshop after orthography workshop, when really it would have been better to move on to making language learning materials and making stories. On the other hand, orthography can be a major aid to the sharing of Sama stories. I have a friend in the Tinutu Sarangani community that he said to me after some time of me interacting with their community, Luke, I want to thank you. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't know how to write our language. I'd come across the sound like in Lukkat or in Amissi, and I wouldn't have any idea how to spell it. And so this sort of orthography issue, if it can be the hindrance between people sharing their stories. They might have an easier time writing Tagalog or an easier time writing English. They might be embarrassed about how their writing of Sinama looks online, and so they choose not to write in Sinama and choose another language. And so in that area, orthography can be an aid, and if you're looking for help in that area, we have suggestions. And I believe that the best way to handle orthography is to write more. And so that has been my goal with Kuman Sama Online, to have more writing in the Sinama language, to write Sinama consistently, and I believe that I've started to see people modeling that online in their own writing. Choice of medium, there's lots of good Sama stories. Actually, Samuel Tan has an article where he discusses how in the Spanish period, the relationship of the people of Sulu to the Spanish was one that they never considered trying to use the Spanish language or the orthography of Spanish to write their languages. And in the same way, Arabic writing was not known well enough throughout Muslim society that a lot of writing of the Muslim languages was done in the Arabic Jawi script. It was more of a language for the cultural elite at the time. And so then, according to Samuel Tan, the coming of the American period, the work of Frank Laubach is one thing that he cites, becomes the way that we start having stories from Sulu written down, and the literature of Sulu starts being developed. And so this is evident in a teacher's magazine in the 1930s that tells the story of the monkey and the winds. But one problem with a lot of the stories as they were told is that they're told in English. And so sometimes we have stories told in Tagalog. And so the medium, what language will we tell the stories in? For me, it seems like getting the story in English, though it has a broader audience, it is Kogun, Kaiman, because the stories were intended for a Sama audience, and it'd be nice to keep the stories relevant to a Sama audience. Another example of this is that a lot of the work of Harry Nemo, the way that a researcher works is the Sinama gets glossed over in order to get an English translation. So I viewed the works of Harry Nemo at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and you have English translations of recordings that he's made, and finally now I have access to the recordings, but no one has transcribed those into Sinama for use by the Sama. And then the question is, what type of publication will we publish these stories in? So I'm going to show you two works, for instance. This should be near and dear to the people of Holo. This is the Sulu Studies 1, and actually in Sulu Studies 1, Sulu Studies 2, and Sulu Studies 3, you have quite a bit of literature from the Sama people in Tausug from Sulu that have been included in this book. But again, the majority of it, for time constraints, is how I read, was the reason, was done in the English language. And then here we have a book put out by Magbasa Kita Foundation. This is the work of Senator Santanina Rasul, And you have here Ang Bundok ni Ayos, Isang Katutubong Kwento ng Mga Sama. You have stories here from the Sama, but they're told in Tagalog. And then, there some of the medium type of publication considerations. Actually, there are quite a few good academic theses done by undergraduate students that are Sama or Tausug for that matter, that are being stored at colleges. I got to view a couple at MSU Tawi-Tawi, a wonderful research done by Bremard about the island of Tabawan and its origin. And another story, Parang Sabi's story about Jukiri, was one of the academic theses at MSU Tawi-Tawi. But the problem is it ends up just being on the shelf and not very accessible to the broader community. So even undergraduate thesis can be a really good avenue to get Sama literature, Sulu literature, but then is it accessible is one of the major problems. Reading primers is another place where Sama stories have gone out, and then the question is, do we still have access to those primers? Which brings up, where we are today with digital opportunities. Actually, it's much easier to share a story on Facebook. It's much easier to share a story on YouTube. Do we have the motivation? And then the final consideration that I want to put before you is ease of access. How can people know where to find Sama stories? Is there a place that puts it all together? And so we've been trying to do that with Pullman Sama Online. We have both the sinama.org website and we have the library.sinama.org website, where the idea is to have as many stories as possible in one place. And hopefully in the future, we will be putting links to stories in other places that they can be found. And so that if you have a story worth sharing, how will we make it available to the Sama as a whole? And one way that I've been trained to do this is through the Bloom library software. Is a way that it's, even a novice computer user can learn how to make a story and make it available to others. The organization Book Dash, which is an organization out of South Africa, they believe that a 5-year-old child should have 100 books that they own in their language. And actually the Bloom library software says the goal is to have 200 books in a person's language so that they can make use of it and encourage them in their education. Unfortunately, in Sinama, we're not there yet. We, on the Library Sinama app on the Google Play Store, we're in around 70 titles, and some of them being better than others, but we haven't made it to 100 yet. This quote by, I really resonate with this quote by Harry Nemo, anthropologist Harry Nemo. He left this as a review on the books that we have put on Amazon in the English language. It's a program that we've done to hopefully fund more illustrated books of Sinama stories. So we put out an English title online for sale, and then we give the stories to Sama schools. And this is what he said, though. He said, although I collected many songs and stories while in the field, they were only a drop in the bucket of all that was available. I'm sure that the current public school curricula in Tawi-Tawi is more sensitive to the local culture. Part of this sensitivity is illustrated by the series of books published by Coleman Sama Online. I was delighted when I learned of their efforts to publish traditional Sama literature in both English and Sinama for instructional as well as recreational use. Unfortunately, that high praise from someone that I highly respect, but unfortunately, even the MTB MLE program now has taken a step back in that I do not believe that Sinama has been continued under the MTB MLE program, and for the most part, the MTB MLE program has been discontinued, and so that all the more leaves us with the question, are we doing this because it's a government program, or are we doing this because it's the right thing to do? And hopefully people in this conference, as well as others, would understand with me that it is a very worthwhile thing to do to make sure that we record our stories, the Sama stories, and that we make them available for generations to come. It's actually essential in helping preserve the language. Another beautiful thing about stories is that you learn language that might not be common to you. The more of the stories of the past that are told, the more the language will be preserved. Language vitality is a concern. Family members of my wife's that have Sama origins choose to represent themselves now as Tausug. In the Davao region, in the South Cotabato region, we notice other languages creeping in on Sinama and being used more frequently by the younger generations. In Sulu, that's not as big of a concern, but it may come as well. And so, in the end, the call to action remains the same, and that's what I want to leave again. I want to return to that call to action. Tell your stories, record your stories, remember your stories, write your stories, and then the final part of that is please do share. Thank you very much, and I hope that we have a good question and answer time. Wassalam.